The transgender rights movement is gaining momentum and increasingly drawing attention. Have services, laws, and greater visibility improved the lives of transgender individuals, and where do they fit in the world at large? Joining us now to discuss that and more, Herschel Russell. He is a psychotherapist, educator, and consultant specializing in LGBT and transgender counseling. Nicole Nussbaum, lawyer and transgender advocate. Danielle Araya, education facilitator at the 519 Church Street Community Centre in Toronto. Kusha Dadui, trans program coordinator at the Sherburne Health Centre, also here in Toronto. And Sherry DeNovo, NDP, member of the Ontario Legislature for Parkdale High Park. She's the critic for her party for LGBTQ issues. And Sherry, in all the time we've had you on the program, I don't think we've ever seen you
with the collar on.
With the collar on. We have to remind everybody you're a United Church minister.
I am indeed.
I know you want to be a minister of the crown, but you actually have been for a long time a minister of the cloth.
And that's primary.
That's primary. Okay. Last night, we played the second part of this documentary by Stephen Fry. Out there, we want to play a little clip off the top, and then we'll come back and chat, okay? Roll tape, please.
I've always loved drag queens. It's one of the, if you like, sort of surprising things to some, is that those who are the most femme, those who glam themselves up and are more than camp, they're actually feminine in their dress and their attire, are probably the most courageous of all the gay community. Historically, it was the drag queens who fought the police at Stonewall that kick-started really the gay liberation movement. It's, I suppose, the daily act of walking down the street in drag makes them often be at the very forefront of the strongest and most angry reactions against homophobia.
Just before we get into our conversation here, we want to remind all of you that you can be part of the conversation. So our producers are hosting a Twitter chat right now. Chime in with your thoughts, and you can use the hashtag on Twitter, AgendaTVO. Herschel, your reaction to what you just saw.
There's some very real truth to that for drag queens, but for drag queens it's a performance where they go on stage, perform, and then they come off the stage and they are once again men. There are many trans women who nobody would know that their history is that of being trans, but there are also many trans women who are visibly trans. And for them, walking out their front door every day requires a level of courage that is really quite extraordinary. And we do know that trans women, in particular trans women of color, are more vulnerable to assault than any other group. So they're facing that very direct physical threat, not to mention the disapproval and the ridicule and all of those awful ways that transphobia works.
Despite the fact that one of the biggest stars on television today is a trans woman of color. We'll get into that in a bit.
Yes.
Stay tuned. Danielle, your view on what you just saw.
Well, I agree with Herschel. I think as a trans woman of color specifically, I feel the struggles of Stonewall still, because as a trans woman of color and Latina, I understand that, you know, our issues are still being met by other communities within the LGBT spectrum. And we're still struggling just to get our voices heard still. And so I think looking back at Stonewall, there were two leaders that were really instigators, I think, in that riot, Sylvia Rivera and Marsha P. Johnson. And a lot of their names and their recognition has been lost over the years because they were women of color. One was Black and one was Latina. And so I think it's always good to remember Stonewall, but remember really who was left out of those discussions, and then the following marches that were claimed by the gay rights movement instead of the trans rights movement.
Remind me, Stonewall is New York City, 1969.
Like the last week of June, and that's why we honor it every June, last week of June here in Toronto.
Gotcha. Okay, Nicole, you saw the clip. Your thoughts?
Well, I think there's a lot of commonality in terms of the issues that face the LGBT community and the trans community. I think a lot of the discrimination and harassment that gay, lesbian, and bisexual people face comes from a societal discomfort with gender variance or gender diversity. And that's what's most visible about people who are LG or B, and certainly it's extremely visible about people who are transgender. I think the point was made that trans people are visible. This is how trans people are. So walking down the street exposes people to being noticed, being surveilled at higher levels, and it becomes difficult for some people to go about their daily life, going shopping, going to work, dealing with those sorts of things.
You can feel it. You can feel being surveyed a lot.
Absolutely. And I think it varies for different people. But yes, there's certainly a heightened sense of fear or awareness of your surroundings to try to make sure that you're safe and that you won't be harassed or assaulted.
Kusha, your view.
I also agree with Daniel. I think she said it beautifully. And I feel that it also is rooted in societal misogyny, like the way that if one is seen as more feminine, they're more prone to abuse. And again, particularly trans women of color, and I see that in my work all the time. It's less safe, and they're more likely to get incarcerated. They're more likely to face abuse and violence.
Sherry.
I would simply add that the courage comes with a cost, and the cost is particularly high for the trans community. We're looking at 50% of the population making less than $15,000 a year. We're looking at high rates of attempted suicide, higher than any other single minority group.
I've seen more than 40%. More than 40% of trans people.
50%.
50% attempt suicide.
Yeah, yeah. So that courage comes with a cost. So that's what I think people need to know about the trans community, and certainly that's something that we really, that message needs to get out, that although the laws changed in Ontario, and we're proud of that, that now we have a lot of work to do to put that law into effect.
We're going to talk about that law in just a second. You were instrumental in making it happen. Transphobia and homophobia, what's the difference?
They overlap in all kinds of important ways, but they're both a repugnance against a group of people around issues of gender.
Homophobia, everybody seems to understand. They know what that is. Do you think the public understands what transphobia is yet?
Barely. And I think people don't often recognize the ways it works. And I think one of the important things here is that it works somewhat differently for trans men than for trans women, and very differently for anyone who's from a racialized minority. That transphobia against trans women is now called transmisogyny, which I think is a really useful term. And someone who's much funnier than me called it misogyny on steroids. And I think that's accurate. But at the core of it is ridicule. There's this assumption that we in our very beings are ridiculous and have no rights to safety, to respect, to belonging, to love, to any of those things. And Laverne Cox, who you were just mentioning, speaks about that so powerfully and effectively.
Let's put her picture up, because
Yes.
I don't know how many of you watching us now know of the television program Orange is the New Black. It's a very popular program, particularly in the United States. There is the first trans woman of color to be sure, ever to make the cover of Time magazine. That's Laverne Cox, who was born Roderick Cox, a man in Alabama, and who is now one of the biggest stars in American pop culture. How important is all of that to what we're talking about here today? Nicole?
Well, I think Laverne Cox would say that she was not born a man, she was born a child. She was assigned a sex, assigned a gender at birth, but that never reflected who she was. So I just want to make that point.
You know, it's a good point. I'm still learning myself what the right way to express all of this is. So to say Laverne Cox was born male is inaccurate in your view.
Well, what you said was she was born a man,
Right.
I think. And male and man can be distinguished. If you look at, I mean, what we do know now that perhaps we didn't know 10 years ago or 20 years ago or 50 years ago is that the process of sex differentiation is much more complex than simply XX is a woman, XY is a man.
The chromosomes.
The chromosomes, and all of the cis sexist assumptions that come with if a child is born XY with particular physical characteristics, that they will then like trucks and sports
No, I get that.
and those sorts of things.
Fair enough. Fair points. Fair points. But Kusha, when you see somebody who's trans on the front of a magazine with a big starring part in a major American television series, award-winning television series, what does that do for the movement?
Me personally, looking at her as a trans woman of color and seeing her speak so eloquently about this, and it makes me feel empowered. You know, I have so much respect for her, and but we still have a long way to go.
Sure, but Sherry, do you think this changes perceptions?
Of course it helps. We need all the help we can get. But the simple reality of life as a trans person in the United States hasn't changed a lot, unfortunately. I mean, we're talking about a country where a lot of people still are outraged by the thought of same-sex marriage. That's a hurdle we've leapt in this country. But that's where they're at. We're living in a world where 80 countries have laws against LGBT people, and 10 of them want to see them executed. 10 of those countries. So again, that's against that backdrop. So of course it helps, and you know, we proudly move forward. But we have to also be aware that that's not the experience of the person walking out their door that we were just speaking about.
Sure.
And that's not the experience of the person attempting suicide. And that's not the experience of the person who's still being denied housing, even in this city and in this province, and who's still being denied a job because of their status. So that's their reality.
Can I put another expression up here, Danielle, which I'm also learning about? Two-spirit. What does that mean?
Well, for those that don't know, Two-Spirit, and I identify as Two-Spirit, is an identity for anyone that's Aboriginal or Indigenous that has, that's part of the LGBT spectrum. So either lesbian, gay, bi, trans, intersex as well is included. And they have to have an Indigenous heritage to claim this title because of the historical connotations that, that were part of the settlers coming to North America and seeing trans people especially that were revered and respected within their cultures. And so these Two-Spirit people that had both male and female spirits were seen as the first maybe targets to maybe deconstruct the cultures that were here in North America, as well as South America, where I'm from.
I have heard white people, though, say they feel Two-Spirit.
Right.
You think that's an inappropriate use?
Like I was mentioning before, the historical connotations were that people came in and destroyed the language and the cultures that these people had, and these titles and the status that were very much important to the whole community. And so when those were taken away and we had to adopt English terms and English ways of thinking about sex and gender, I think it made a disservice to all kinds of people, not just the Native people. And I think now it's a way to reclaim that past and also move ahead in the future and hopefully empower those people that are still struggling because of their Native identities.
Okay. You will all forgive me, at some point we want to make some comparisons here to the gay rights movement, because
Sure.
in the Venn diagram of these two struggles there are some overlapping areas. However, there are some differences as well. And Herschel, let me start with you on this. On the issue of same-sex marriage, which is a hurdle that in Canada has now been passed, did that have any spin-off benefit to the civil rights struggle for the trans world?
It's a bit of a complicated piece, Steve, that you know, gay liberation moved from gay liberation, which was really quite a revolutionary movement, to something focused on becoming more normal, on becoming married. We're just like the straight people, except we love different people. Of course, everyone should have civil rights. I would never argue anything other than that. But in that thrust, we moved from kind of gay liberation to gay pride, which was much more about fitting in and much less about making fundamental change, and really left behind our most vulnerable folks. And I would still say that trans people are overwhelmingly the most vulnerable of those groups. And the push towards gay marriage, yeah, we should all have civil rights, but that didn't address what Sherry's talking about, the levels of unemployment. The levels of unemployment, be it noted, despite the fact that we're one of the most highly educated groups in Canada and also in America. There's 2 research studies that demonstrate that very clearly. And a group with these horrifying rates of suicidality, that move towards same-sex marriage did not address those issues of the most vulnerable.
This will be overly simplifying things, so you'll help me out here. But I've heard it described that same-sex marriage and gay rights is all about who you love, whereas trans rights, as we're talking about today, is more about who you are. Is that fair to say?
That'll do just fine. That'll do just fine. The way I generally say it is gender identity is something very profound. There's a lovely research study about children where a child says, I know that I'm a little boy way down deep where the music plays, which I think is where we know what our gender is, where sexual orientation, who I love, is something that's kind of coming out of me. So gender identity is who I am, sexual orientation is who I long for, who I desire.
Gotcha. You did refer, Sherry, a few moments ago to the fact that I guess it was a little over 2 years ago that all three parties in the Ontario legislature supported something called Toby's Law, which was something that you were certainly the spiritual guide of, if I can put it that way. What is that law?
I tabled it 5 times. It adds gender identity and gender expression to the Ontario Human Rights Code. So for the first time in history in Ontario, trans folk are covered by human rights and civil rights. So it's a huge step forward. It makes us the foremost province of all of North America, certainly in terms of its legality. And it was named after our music director at my church, hence the collar, among other reasons, Toby Dancer, who died tragically, again, not uncommonly in the trans community, sadly, and is immortalized in stained glass at Emmanuel Howard Park United Church on Roncesvalles, which has become a place of pilgrimage for trans folk from all over North America and the world who have their pictures taken next to that window. And as I said at Toby's funeral, perhaps the only church in the world with a trans person, memorialized in stained glass, and somebody at the funeral screamed out, "What about Joan of Arc?"
How did Toby die?
Overdose.
And let me get the language right here. Toby was born what and?
Male to female trans.
Male to female trans. Okay.
Yes.
Did I do okay on that? I'm getting there, okay? I'm getting there. Nicole, legal protection, that's an Ontario law. Let's look federally. Legal protections for trans people, nationally speaking, what is there?
Legal protections exist across the country for trans people based on gender identity, which has been found as a protected ground under the ground of sex and historically under the ground of disability. There has been a push, though, to make those protections known through legislative changes to add gender identity and gender expression explicitly. So now we have Ontario, Manitoba, Nova Scotia, Prince Edward Island, Newfoundland and Labrador, and the Northwest Territories that all have explicit protections. And the benefit of explicit protections is it helps trans people know that the protections exist, and it also creates an impetus for employers, landlords, those sorts of public actors to be able to provide a workplace or a housing environment that's free from discrimination and harassment.
Is this part of C-279, the bill?
C-279 is a federal bill to change the Canadian Human Rights Act to include gender identity and to add gender identity under the hate crimes provisions of the criminal code.
Why have I heard it referred to as the bathroom bill?
I think the bills are to deal with tremendous rates of discrimination and harassment in employment. We know in Ontario that between 13 and 28% of people have been fired because they're trans. We know that between 18 and 50% of people have been turned down for a job because they're transgender. We know that people experience discrimination and harassment in housing and in accessing a number of other services. The attempt to label this as a bathroom bill really detracts from the purpose of the bill, which is to provide those protections, and also serves to try to other trans people who, in terms of washroom use, trans people use the washroom for the same reasons that everybody else does. Trans people use change rooms for the same reasons that everybody else does. And it's used to create some kind of fear or to label trans people as sexual predators or things like that, and to really draw on the fears that may exist based on ignorance of who trans people are.
Okay, I get that, but Kusha, what would you propose we do about the situation that this bill presumably tries to deal with, where only women use a women's bathroom and then suddenly a trans person walks in who may be in the process of?
I mean, there's a lot of education that needs to be done. There is, like Nicole said, this big thing about trans folks being seen as sexual predators when they go into a washroom, which is, I mean, that kind of thing can happen anywhere and by anyone. I mean, that's preposterous to think that way. And I feel like also with the law, it's, I was just having this conversation before, it's one of those things where one of the things is very punitive. And like, for instance, if I, as a trans person, go for a job and don't get the job because I'm a trans person, it's up to me to prove that I didn't get the job. And the burden's on me, and that becomes more difficult. And
How would you know anyway? It sounds like a hard thing to prove, isn't it?
Well, I mean, it starts with very simple things like my ID, for example. You know, if my ID says female, which it does, and if I go and, you know, for a job and it's confusing and I have to explain all of this, and if I'm qualified and I don't get it, then I can clearly presume that it might be because of that. And it becomes harder and harder to prove, right? And if the burden of proof is on me, then there's really no protection there. And also, it doesn't focus on the systematic issues a lot. It just focuses on, so this transphobic thing has happened, and on punitive rather than systematic issues. And we need to, I mean, this law would also systematically have some protection, which would be great.
The issue of washroom safety is one that's of tremendous importance to trans people. It happens to be trans people who are most frequently harassed or assaulted in washrooms. And this bill will actually help create a safer environment for everybody in the washrooms. There are simple adjustments that can be made to washroom or change room design, installation of privacy curtains, or other physical changes that make this space safe and accessible for everybody, for somebody who wants a little bit more privacy for themselves, or be that a trans person or another person. So that's one thing. This bill is really about ensuring safety for washrooms for everyone.
Okay, I get that, but Sherry, okay, you want to say something and then I'll follow up.
I mean, calling this bill a bathroom bill is profoundly transphobic. It comes from the same roots as I remember them well, I'm old enough, the attacks on gay rights that, oh my goodness, all of a sudden the person at the head of the classroom who's out as gay and allowed to keep their job will prey upon our sons. It comes from the same place, and we have to really call it for what it is. It's hatred of trans people. At no time does this bill say it's okay, and remember we're talking about human rights here, no time does somebody in support of human rights for all people say it's okay for a straight man to dress up as a woman, to go assault women in washrooms. To even make the connection is profoundly transphobic.
You read the Toronto Sun, you have to for your job, right? I mean, somebody wrote a column in the Toronto Sun laying out that case.
And has to be fought at every turn, and has to be challenged at every turn. One of the reasons I'm wearing a collar is to show that you can be a person, a religious person, a person of faith, and not be homophobic or transphobic. Most of us are not homophobic and transphobic, and people hide behind religion to be transphobic and homophobic. Well, they hide behind columnists in the Toronto Sun too, but name it. It's transphobic. That's what it is. It's hatred by any other name, and we really need to challenge it. We can't let it go. We can't even dissect it. We simply have to name it. It's the same kind of hatred we've been seeing since the beginning of the LGBT rights movement, and quite frankly, the same as women's liberation or any other liberation movement is met with the same kind of hatred in a different form. This is it.
Except the columnist did chronicle one example of where the thing that we've been talking about here actually did happen.
Which was then queried, if I may butt in here, Steve, which was then queried by someone who called every gym in the area to ask if this had happened. And there was no evidence that it had happened. This was likely made up out of whole cloth. This is not actually something that happened, but something that was invented by the
Okay, I think the
journalist.
story was an urban myth? I think the story
It was a
something...
changing room at a gym.
Well, I heard one of a woman's shelter. Somebody dressed up as a man dressing up as a woman, went to a women's shelter in order to prey upon, as apparently he did, some unsuspecting woman. And
that one I didn't read.
It
The
was
one
a
I
problem.
did read and heard about was, and I think I would have heard about one in a shelter, but the one I did read that was in the Sun, and I did hear the critique of it, the critique was that it was supposed to be in a gym, but there's apparently no gym that has experienced such a thing. And certainly just to take other countries in which these kinds of laws have been passed, has there been an upswing in the number of assaults in bathrooms? No, there has not. The people who get assaulted in bathrooms are trans people. And I think I want to just say a little bit. I want people to imagine the level of strain for anyone who is seen as gender ambiguous. I need to use the bathroom in some public situation, and I have this choice. I can go to the women's bathroom, where women tend to look at each other and are very ready to speak to each other. The likelihood of being harassed is very high. It may include the police being called. So that's one of my choices. The other choice is to go to the men's bathroom. Men don't look at each other. Men don't generally speak to each other, but that's where assault mostly happens. So I need to go to the bathroom. I can choose between high risk of harassment, low but real risk of sexual assault. I want you to imagine the impact on our anxiety. I want you to imagine the impact on our self-confidence. It's embarrassing. So this piece that Sherry was talking about how this is one of the fundamental ways transphobia works, to harm us on a daily, everyday basis, that we can't do this simple physiological thing without taking significant risks.
Is the solution to that unisex or what am I trying to say here?
Gender neutral?
Gender neutral bathrooms.
Yes.
I cut the ribbon on one at City View School,
You did.
the first public school in Toronto.
What do all the parents think of that?
Well, I always say, do you have a gendered washroom at home? How many
but only
homes
one
exist with a gendered
Okay.
washroom?
But only one person can fit it in at a time.
I go into businesses all the time now where there's a couple of stalls and they have male, female on it, they are nothing. I mean, this is really, this is not that difficult to accommodate. If a public school can do it, and if we do it at homes, even with more than one bathroom, we can do it anywhere.
Okay.
To add what Herschel and Sherry were saying, a lot of the health issues that trans folks deal with comes from that. Because in the public, because of safety, you will not go to the washroom, and a lot of issues around kidney failure or health issues that come with that. It's
I get you.
yeah.
Let's return to the documentary for a second here. Here's another excerpt from Stephen Fry's documentary. You can watch the monitors here in the studio for this clip. He went all over the world, to a lot of different countries to do this documentary, and he went to India and had a meeting with a group of, am I saying this correctly? Hijra?
Yes.
Hijra. Male to female transgender community. Let's roll tape and then we'll chat. Roll tape, please.
It's upsetting to hear how rejected the Hijras have become. But it's made me realize that even amongst my own gay community back home, transgenders are often the least accepted and understood. As India's gay community gets organized, it's showing signs of reaching out to its more vulnerable members, and there could be a lesson in that for all of us.
Danielle, this is kind of a strange angle on the story, insofar as I guess I need to know, to what extent do you think gays and lesbians discriminate against the transgender community?
That's a great question, because it does happen. We would think otherwise, but I think what happens in a lot of human rights struggles are some people get a lot of attention, have a lot of maybe a platform to speak from, and then take over the conversation, while other people get left behind and are left in the shadows. And in the case of trans people, that's what happened to us, and it's still happening. So I think in different countries around the world, there are different levels, I guess, of social power that some people have. Like if you're male, if you're straight or cis, you definitely have more of a voice than other people. And I think in this culture, they had a place in their society, but now it's maybe being flipped around.
You dropped an expression there that I'm not sure all of our viewers will know.
Great.
Cis. What's that?
So cis would be the antithesis of trans. So we are trans people, and the opposite would be cis, and that's somebody that's born, they're assigned male at birth and maybe live their whole life as a gender that's male. So it's just a complementary kind of title. So for trans people, maybe our sex and our gender don't match, and then the conflicts that come from that is to prove to society that who we are, and that could be legal barriers, social barriers, all kinds of changes that we might have to do, and that's usually transitioning.
I notice in your critics title, Sherry, you're the LGBTQ critic for the NDP.
Probably add I as well. For
And I at
intersex,
the end.
yeah.
We did a program on that last week,
Yeah.
yes. But the gays and lesbians, from what I'm hearing, don't always feel comfortable being mentioned in the same sentence as the T. Are you finding that? Is that an issue?
Well, it's complicated, but I would say that to back up what Danielle has said about it, you go through various stages as a liberation movement. I mean, there was, I'm again old enough to remember back when, bisexual folk were thought of, oh, well, they're just not brave enough, they just haven't come out yet. Then gradually the B got added in, and the thinking back then was, well, trans folk, they're buying into the stereotypes, there were, again, this is an educational process, and we as a community, we as a province, we as a jurisdiction are moving forward, and we're getting to know each other. I mean, at the end of the day, this is about human rights. This is about being the human you were called to be, being the human you were born to be, and not fitting into somebody else's definition of you, and still having the same rights as everyone else. So I think that's important to come back to that.
If you didn't like my raising the Toronto Sun earlier, you're really not going to like my raising the Globe and Mail right now. Did you all read Margaret Wente's column about this? Not too long ago. This was in August. Let me read a little excerpt from it, and then we'll chat, shall we? Here's Peggy Wente in the Globe and Mail. The mainstreaming of transgenderism is in some ways a logical extension of the civil rights and diversity movements that have transformed society for the better. But it is also the story of advocacy run amok, in which a small but militant group of activists has managed to strong-arm well-meaning people into believing that gender is not innate but, quote, assigned, that those who are, quote, trapped in the wrong body would be happier with radical hormone treatments and mutilating surgery, and that children as young as 1 or 2 should be pushed along a path whose implications they are far too young to understand. I can see you all champing at the bit to want to respond to that. Okay, Herschel, start us off. Your comment on that?
All right. I just wanted to actually back up a bit to the to the part of the show about the hijras. It's not the part you showed, but in the actual episode, there's some quite concerning things. But just to be very brief here, it's important to acknowledge that we have been fighting back strategically and smartly and wisely and with enormous effort for a long time. It's not just that we need other folks to come and kindly pat us on the head. We are struggling and often having successes, especially with wonderful leaders like Laverne Cox. And that's certainly true in India. Some of the hijras are in Parliament making changes to laws around sex work, and that's not at all. Stephen Fry's presentation was very much around we should be nicer.
Patronizing.
Thank you.
A bit too patronizing?
Patronizing and paternalistic. To go to Margaret Wente, I sometimes think, well, okay, if Margaret Wente is critiquing us, it means we were entering the mainstream because she's just there to be obnoxious.
Well, she's
that's
a
her
columnist.
job.
That's her job.
That's her
job is
job.
to provoke.
Her job is
She's
to
on this
provoke.
show.
But the work around gender diverse kids is just so tremendously important. These are the most vulnerable of the most vulnerable. These kids who often are very clear, not always at 2 or 3, sometimes at 7 or 8, at puberty, as young adults, and so on, as people in their 70s. Being trans can arise at any point in the life cycle. But the kids are the most vulnerable. And I think it's one of the places that we are making dramatic and exciting strides right now. And it's a grassroots movement of parents seeing that forcing their children into the wrong clothing, wrong toys, and so on is harmful to them, and saying, I don't want to hurt my kid that way. And the rest of us, I think, are trying to catch up with those families.
But Nicole, if I'm inferring correctly here, the column seems to be saying, take a chill pill, settle down, everybody. You're going too far, too fast, and it's a bit out of control right now. How do you react to that?
I appreciate Margaret Wente's concern for trans youth, for youth who are gender creative, who have non-stereotypically gendered interests. But the problem that Ms. Wente had was she's conflating a lot of different issues. She's conflating issues of adults and rights. She's conflating social transition and medical transition. She's conflating support for gender creativity in children and pushing children into a transition path. There's nobody in Canada that's performing surgeries on children. What we're, I think, in terms of the professionals that are dealing with transgender children or supporting transgender children, the children that they're dealing with will refuse to go to school. They may attempt suicide at very young ages. They won't be undressed in public, or they won't be undressed, period, because they're so uncomfortable with their physical bodies.
For gym class or something,
For
whatever.
gym class.
Yeah.
So these are, for children who are getting, who are socially transitioning at these ages, it's really to enable them to function. There's some very important statistics from the Trans Pulse Project that show that trans youth with very strongly supportive parents have much lower rates of suicidal ideation and attempts, and trans youth with parents that aren't strongly supportive have 57% of those youth have attempted suicide in the last year versus 4%. 100% of trans youth with strongly supportive parents have adequate housing versus 45%. We know that these are significant issues that are being assisted by a social transition, and at a later age, when puberty starts, there's an option for pubertal suppression therapy, which is actually a conservative therapy to allow trans youth more time to determine what path is best for them.
And Steve,
sure.
there's actually, there are surgeries being performed on babies, but they're on intersex babies. And the surgeries that are being performed on them are to make them conform with what the surgeon and the medical team thinks they should be. So if your clitoris is too large or your penis is too small, that surgery is still being performed. All I would say to Margaret Wente is do your research a little bit better, because actually the surgical intervention on children that we should be questioning is that surgery, not anything. Of course, it's not happening at all, as Nicole said, which is trans positive surgery is not happening until much later.
Okay.
And also the other point of this is, I mean, again, we have to challenge those viewpoints, and there were challenges to that article. I mean, again, I come back to those statistics. When 50% of the population, and Nicole has told us these statistics, this is an incredibly marginalized group. To attack them, as Margaret Wente did, is just absolutely the antithesis of compassion. I mean, this is hatred, and we have to name it as such.
Okay, let me push back on Margaret's behalf here, just insofar as, can you criticize the movement for broader trans rights without being thought of as being transphobic?
I think there's just not enough trans rights, period, to resist that still. And so I think when we have more of a platform, if we have political power, if we have social power, then I think then you can resist it. But she's resisting, children just being possibly trans, and they don't have to be trans. They could be gender independent or creative, as I've heard today. And so there are options out there, and it's limiting these choices that's the problem, not allowing children just to explore whatever identity they want to have. And fixating on the surgeries, again, is another problem that as trans people, we always have to fight against that. We don't all want surgery. We don't all want to mutilate our bodies like people always claim we do. We have rights and choices for ourselves, and we can pick whatever path we want. And I think it's limiting trans people's own autonomy to really say that we all want one path.
Gotcha. Kusha.
Particularly I work with a lot of trans youth, and what I'm seeing right now is a lot of ways being. I would say there are many ways, there are as many genders as there are human beings, right? There are so many different ways of being, and that's the most beautiful thing. And to just kind of push that all trans people want to do this, or even if they do, why would you call it mutilating? That's really transphobic. I find that really offensive and transphobic. And about I wanted to make a point about the Stephen Fry documentary. I found that it's actually, it was kind of offensive to me that the notion of anti-homophobic and anti-transphobia work being a white liberal thing is quite offensive to me, and I feel like that's quite racist. And like, for instance, at World Pride, there was this whole notion that Canada has to be a beacon of hope for all these countries in the world, where actually the root, a lot of transphobia and homophobia in those countries comes from colonization. So I just want to make that point.
Okay, fair enough.
And in terms of trans youth, and shelters, for example. I just felt like I had to make that point. Also with shelters, because we brought that up, there is this big issue because they put trans women in men's shelter and they put trans men in women's shelter, and that's actually not safe. And there is no shelter for trans youth. I mean, there are very few, and they're not safe. So these are the issues that we're dealing with, and unless we get like these things settled, and until we have an adequate shelter, adequate jobs, adequate protection at work,
But
all
this
of
is
those
the point.
things.
Let me pick up on that point because, Sherry, let me go to you first on this. I think I read a statistic somewhere that says that 65% of Canadians either have somebody in their family or have a very close family friend who's gay. So the possibilities of having daily interaction with a gay or lesbian person are there in the lives of Mr. and Mrs. Everyday Ontario, if I can put it that way. I know that's an awful way to put it, but you know what I mean. The number of trans people in our society is 0.5%? And no, you're shaking your heads.
No.
That's what I've read, 0.5%.
There's huge controversies about the prevalence of trans people in the population. You'll still read in scholarly literature 1 in 30,000, which is incredibly easy to disprove. There have been 3 recent studies, one in Thailand, one in Massachusetts, one in England. The one in Thailand and the one in Massachusetts came up with 1 in 200, okay? And the one in England
Well, 1 in 200 is 0.5%.
Did I get that wrong? I did. Okay, but I just want to emphasize that 1 in 200, 0.5%, it's still quite a few people.
Well,
Stephen.
but my point
and
is...
I want to say one more thing, may I? That one of the things we also know from a couple of studies is that the numbers of people identifying as trans are growing extremely quickly. So
Okay.
that's one of the pieces we need to know.
I hear you, Herschel, but Sherry, help me with this here, because if it is 0.5%, let's say Herschel's number's right, 1 in 200 is 0.5%, those daily interactions aren't happening, and therefore the opportunity to have those kinds of learning experiences aren't there. Isn't that part of the problem if you're trying to get people to get this?
It's very interesting. In 1948, Kinsey put out his sexual scale. And in that, very few people, in fact, are absolutely heterosexual according to the so-called norms. And that was in 1948. So I would say, first of all, to folk who don't think they have anything in common with trans folk or never met one, let's say, is look in the mirror, look at your own sexuality, your own self, and do a little bit of self-analysis, because chances are you're not as straight as you think you are. So I would say, first of all, know thyself. That's kind of a classic. Second of all, I mean, it doesn't take knowing somebody or having somebody in your family to be able to extend compassion to folk. I mean, this is really what all our great faiths teach. And all we're talking about here is just to, it doesn't take a great leap of imagination to imagine yourself as someone different. You don't have to be a person of color to know that racism is bad. You don't have to be a trans person to know that transphobia is wrong. I mean, again, this is kind of common sense, I would hope. But what you're pointing to, which I think is very important, is education. And that is something that we discussed before the show, and we all agree that's the next step. We really need to have a better educational program for all of these issues in our schools and beyond.
Well, to that end, can I read something here from the Toronto District School Board? These are the guidelines for the accommodation of transgender and gender nonconforming students and staff. These came out last year. Sheldon, if you would, let's bring this graphic up. All students, including transgender and gender nonconforming students, have the right to be addressed by a preferred name and pronouns corresponding to their gender identity. This is true regardless of whether the student has obtained a legal name or sex designation change. Intentionally addressing a student by the incorrect name or pronoun may be considered a form of discrimination and is not condoned. This directive does not prohibit inadvertent slips or honest mistakes, but it does apply to the intentional and/or persistent refusal to acknowledge or use a student's gender identity. Students who wish to use pronouns other than the masculine or feminine, such as, again, help me with pronunciation here, is it Z?
Z, like he or she.
Here, or they, need to be accommodated equally. Okay, Danielle, help me there, because you were right on that. Z and here refers to what?
It's just a gender-neutral pronoun. Instead of he or she, you'd use Z. Instead of his or her, I believe, you'd use here. And they is great for everyone. If you don't know a pronoun, always go for they
Go for
instead
they,
of
'cause it's-
assuming and making the wrong assumption and hurting someone's feelings, because
Okay.
pronouns are really important.
Do I infer that you think that's not bad?
Sounds good. Knowing from my experience, I loathe going to school because of attendance, of the pronouns, gym, everything like we were talking about earlier. And knowing about that, and maybe having parents know about that, would make them feel more secure in sending their children, who might be trans, who might not be, maybe gender fluid, maybe genderqueer. Going to school it can be very traumatic, and having these policies in place and having protections for youth that might be gender fluid or any gender non-conforming way, I think is really important, because there's lots of violence that can happen in schools, and a lot of people avoid schools, like you were just mentioning. Why don't you see people in schools or workplaces? Maybe because we're hiding, because we know what we can suffer if we go to these institutions that should be protecting us.
Sherry, this is the policy.
I think it's a great one.
It's okay.
I wish
Do
it were
we follow
adhered
it?
to. Well, I think it's beginning to be adhered to. And again, there was a little softness of language there, which I think helps, because people need to be educated themselves. The teachers need an education. So it's a process. It's a process, but this is a good step.
Kusha?
One point that I want to make is about trans newcomers and refugees. I mean, ESL classes are not necessarily safe. That's why a lot of them don't continue, and that has an impact on their well-being, and access to healthcare for them, and all of that. I mean, that's not necessarily protected under the law either, right? Because they're refugees. They're not necessary, right? And they don't feel safe. So that's really not. And I find that ESL classes are not necessary. Working with them, talking to them, I know that healthcare providers and ESL classes and just generally schools are not safe places for them.
Well, let me follow up with Nicole on that. We've heard a lot today about where it's not safe to be a part of the trans community. Where is it safe to be?
Where is it safe to be?
Yeah, where in Canada is it a decent, safe place to live as you are, as a member of the transgendered world?
I think for many trans people, anywhere in Canada is a safe and good place to be. But that's not true across the board, and it's not true in specific locations. In larger cities, in Toronto, there's a very vibrant and large trans community where people can access safe space, access services where the service provider is trans knowledgeable and trans welcoming. But that's not the case necessarily in smaller centers or rural areas. Getting back to the education piece, I think that's a big piece of the puzzle. I think with respect to Laverne Cox, one of the contributions that she's made is that now a lot of people know a trans person, right? And that's really created a major impact. So there has been, I think, a sea change in attitudes towards trans people as a result of changes to legislation, but also on the cultural side of things with people like Janet Mock and Laverne Cox and a number of other people who've brought trans lives and trans experience to the mainstream in a very normalizing way and in a very accessible way.
Danielle, apropos of what you were saying earlier, I've seen Laverne Cox on many talk shows. Mm-hmm. She never talks about whatever surgery she did or did not have. You support that decision, I guess. Of
course, yeah. She wants to get to the point, and like we were doing today, talk about the stats and the important numbers of the trans community suffering with violence, suffering with lack of education, employment, and our own internalized violence where we commit suicide. So I think when she talks about those points, she's doing a service to the whole community at large, and especially for the Black trans community in the States, which suffers a lot of violence comparatively to Canada. And so I think her platform is growing, and she has other allies and friends that are doing the work as well, and it's wonderful to see so many trans voices and faces on TV now.
Let me finish with this, Sherry, with you. We got a minute left here. There are lots of people in Ontario who are probably watching this right now thinking, I just had again, you'll hate the word, but here we go. I just had a normal Ontario upbringing. It's all I can do to sort of get myself to finally sign up to same-sex marriage. And, holy cow, this is a lot of change in a very short period of time. Give me a break. What would you say to them?
Are they using cell phones? Are they using the internet? Look how fast the technological change has come upon us. But I wanted to get back to Danielle's point too. Listen, I don't talk about my genitals at dinner parties or in public, and I don't see why we expect that trans folk should either. I think that's absolutely beyond the pale, and the fact that we expect that from trans folk and don't expect it from anybody else is
not
kind
quite
of
true. Not quite true. If boy, this is really not a great subject to get into with 30 seconds left. But if somebody had cancer surgery, for example, and had breast augmentation or that kind of surgery, you might ask somebody about it if you were close enough.
Well, but again, these are very personal issues, and trans is not a cancer. This trans status is not a cancer. So I would just say, again, if you don't know much about this issue, please read. There's lots of information out there. Please educate yourself. That's incumbent upon you. And at the end of the day, love your neighbor.
Love your neighbor is always good advice. Okay. Thanks, everybody, for coming on the program here on TVO tonight. Really grateful for your time, and hopefully we've made a modest contribution to the issues that you're all working with day by day by day. Thanks so much.
Thanks.
Support Ontario's public television. Donate at tvo.org.